that would be madness, that sort of back and forth import-export thing.
In the UK, there was a thing recently where English-grown apples were exported to South Africa to be waxed before being imported back to the UK and being sold as local food.
And as you mentioned, that's the sort of thing that can only happen in a world with unlimited cheap oil.
Exactly. So, our starting point is, very often you can have a kind of an environmental perspective which says economic growth is bad and having a car is bad and flying on airplanes is bad. And we much more come at it from the perspective of how on earth are we going to keep 30 million cars on the road of this country with volatile oil prices? Actually, we're moving from a time when our degree of oil consumption has been directly linked to how successful we've been. The more oil you consume, the more successful you are, to a time when our degree of oil dependency is the key vulnerability. And I think that's a hugely, hugely important shift. So it's not about a big list of good and bad things. It's really saying we're all in a position where we're all addicted to oil in that sense. And how are we going to break that addiction in such a way that where we emerge at the end, we actually feel better there?
Now, Rob, the city of Edmonton, of course, is a large municipality here in Canada. So what are some of the policy changes that you would see that we would need to consider in order to reduce the vulnerability on the road ahead?
I think a lot of the stuff that needs to happen in somewhere like Edmonton is, I think there's certainly issues around land use planning, reducing the need for cars, creating more walkable neighbourhoods to have the things that people actually need in their daily lives closer to where they are, public transport, building houses, new housing to a kind of passive house standard so they don't need any space heating at all. But building those using, there's a model being developed in Wales called the local passive house, the idea that you could build a house that requires no space heating and 90% of the materials are local natural materials. We're getting somewhere really exciting with that in terms of the potential to create more work locally for people. I think there's definitely a thing about starting to reduce the amount of land that's currently dedicated to cars and maybe reallocating some of that back for intensive urban market gardening, bringing food production back into cities, looking at derelict land and urban land in that kind of a context. I think as well for municipal authorities, there's a really important principle which I think we've moved dangerously away from. One of the key aspects of resilience is the ability to experiment and the ability to fail. And I think local authorities have become so obsessed and under such pressure from national government to deliver all the time that they feel very wary now of any process that involves them taking risks and potentially failing. And in transition, we celebrate failure as much as success because the fact that people are having a go and sharing their successes is really, really important. There's a very good report done for San Beunaventura called the San Beunaventura Post-Oil Plan, which is a really interesting look at actually how a city can make this kind of shift. For me, one of the key things is that the push for it, that the drive is coming from a community level. That there is a really deep participation and a really deep engagement of the people who live within the city, and that is through things like participatory budgeting, planning, these kind of things. And also I think that the local authority is really straight with people, that actually is able to say, we're doing what we're doing because we're really concerned about what's happening in terms of energy availability and the future picture for that. And we're responding accordingly because ultimately the local authority has a duty of care for the people who live there. And if it's completely ignored this question until it's a really perilous crisis, that's deeply irresponsible. So I don't see any reason why a local authority can't be really straight with people about that, but can still present the solutions that it's taking in a very positive light.
Now, Rob, as you know, Edmonton is a large cold climate city, at least for part of the year, and there are other cities internationally that are like us. Cities like Moscow, Stockholm come to mind. What do you see as some of the special challenges for us?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I always say, when people get in touch with us and say, "What should transition look like in Sao Paulo?" And I say, "I have absolutely no idea. I've never been to Sao Paulo." And really, what we offer is sort of principles and a lens to look at this challenge through. But what it actually looks like in different places on the ground, really, I'm sure you have a much better idea than I do because I've never been.
Okay, fair enough. You mentioned principles, and of course, there are tools that the transition communities and the transition initiatives can use to involve the widest range of community and cultural groups. Tell me about this.
Well, we use various tools for trying to engage people in a creative way and to kind of draw them in a way that they self-organize. So one of those is Open Space, which is a fantastic tool for bringing up to 1,000 people together to brainstorm around a particular issue, food or transport or whatever, in such a way that they organize and run the whole meeting themselves. If you're a control freak, organizing an open space meeting is terrifying, but it always works. There are things like Open World Cafe, which is quite similar. Things like a fishbowl, which is a very good way of facilitating discussions around different issues. Something called Transition Tales that we've developed that we work with kids in local schools with, where we take them through a process of looking at peak oil and climate change and how it's going to affect their lives. And then at the end, they're the television newsreaders in the local area in 2030. So they're on Totnes television reading the news, and they make up the stories. And we film them and edit them together like a TV news broadcast, and then we put them online and they put them on their social networking sites. We do quite a lot of oral history work, oral history interviews, looking at how things work before cheap oil made everything possible. And there's lots of other tools and exercises that take too long to explain.
Rob, I want to return to the topic of Edmonton. Now, specific to Edmonton, specific to our location, our population, our urban sprawl, climate, and in particular, our fossil fuel extraction-based economy, what other advice would you have for the city of Edmonton and its residents?
Try and move away from the idea that if you want to make change happen, that what you do is you bring in a coach load of experts with clipboards who all hop off and draw you a plan and then leave again. It feels much more resilient in the long term that actually communities take ownership of this, because communities are able to read the terrain in much more detailed, subtle levels than national top-down government ever can. So local people can start local food gardens. They know the people. They can get into the lofts and insulate buildings and this, that, and the other. They need some support and help from government, but there's a huge amount that communities can do. And people sometimes say, well, we can't start a transition project. We haven't got any money. We need a big grant from government in order to be able to do this. And we always say, well, actually, if you start this process and you start it right, what happens is you unleash a huge amount of goodwill and energy and enthusiasm. And I'd rather have that enthusiasm than money, because you cannot buy that. You could have the biggest grant in the world and you can't buy people who are engaged and enthusiastic. And so for me, I suppose that the main thing is really, like I said before, it's like, what does engaged optimism look like on the ground? What can we do with that? How can we create a process in Edmonton which feels like a historic opportunity to design for the future, and to not sort of bury a head in the sand and pretend that this isn't happening, but actually, human beings are capable of extraordinary genius and brilliance if they're focused on the right questions. So, these things have to happen at all scales. I'm not saying for a minute that local communities can do everything, that local communities on their own are going to solve climate change and it's all going to be fantastic. It needs local government, it needs national government, it needs international government. But more and more, it becomes very clear that actually the local community side, the government side of it and the local government side of it really struggle if it doesn't feel it has a groundswell of people who want this. And the role of government becomes to enable and support what communities are doing, and that was kind of always, as I understood it, the point of democracy in the first place. See if there's already some people out there in Edmonton who are making a start on this process within their neighbourhoods. Organise an event and then see where the momentum is from that. Often, I think in the environmental movement, people have tended not to be so aware of the language they use and how things are presented, and how to a lot of people that can be quite a turn-off. And I think in transition, we try very hard to present this stuff in a way that a lot of people feel is accessible. So, we always say, in transition, let it go where it wants to go. You start a process, and as if it started with an intention of compassion and humility and service, and starting something that needs to be started at this time, and then seeing where it wants to go, then you're always going to be amazed at what happens.